Welcome to the Enabling Automation podcast. This is the fifth episode of our second season, and we're going to talk about building a sustainable high-tech company. I'm your host, Simon Drexler. I've been a member of the automation industry for about 15 years in a variety of roles, scaling both innovation and growth of company in both small and large enterprises. The goal of our podcast is to bring experts from across the ATS group of companies to talk about pertinent topics to the industry as a way and a means to help our listeners scale their business using technology and innovation. We're very fortunate to have a guest who's an expert in the area of sustainability in Cheryl Gasparet. Cheryl, can you give a quick introduction to our listener base?
Hi, sure, I'd be happy to. So thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Cheryl Gasparet. I'm the Corporate Director for Health, Safety, and Environment with ATS. I've been with ATS now for, 14 years. So it's been a nice long journey with the company, but an exciting one and one that's been a lot of fun along the way.
Right, and one that's brought you all around the world as well, right?
Yeah, can't complain about that. It's been excellent.
Well, why don't we jump right into the topic of sustainability? And what I've seen a lot is it's very rare that you find anyone who takes issue with the idea of sustainability. It's usually something that fairly top of mind as a discussion point. But there are companies that may not take a lot of action towards sustainability. So, as an expert in the field, where would you recommend companies get started?
Right. Well, sustainability really is a huge area, and to your point, it's one that's in the news. It's one that comes up time and again, more in terms of evaluating companies, and it encompasses a lot. Sustainability in its simplest terms is really about making sure that we have the resources that we need to, as a company, to thrive today, while ensuring that we have the resources that we'll need for tomorrow. So, in terms of starting out on that sustainability journey, my view personally is to really spend some time boiling down to what's most important for you as a company in terms of your resources. When you look at sustainability, you hear things about biodiversity, about water conservation, about energy, about people, about influencing the social good, in the communities where you live and work. So, my recommendation is to first of all start with identifying really what's most important to your company. In formal terms, that gets referred to as a materiality assessment. But really, what it comes down to is identifying in that whole broad field of sustainability what's really going to make the biggest impact on your company. Remaining successful today and being successful tomorrow in terms of resources, and identify those points and start there.
I think that's a great piece of advice for how to get started because there are a number of these topics, and one we generally mention a lot is Industry 4.0, and how do you get started there?
Right.
And it can be very difficult in these very broad and overarching topics on how to just get moving because it feels like you're trying to boil the ocean or trying to eat the elephant in one bite because it's just such a big and vast topic.
Right.
And so you mentioned a number of streams in there, energy, biodiversity, social, corporate responsibility. How would somebody start to look at the materiality of that? Another word that I really liked there is, how do you start to see like what's actually important to you? Is that by industry? Is that by geography?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can speak to, in our case, when at ATS, when we, started down and really formalized our pathway along sustainability, we did a materiality assessment where we actually did a survey. We reached out to internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders in terms of investors and also our customers to ask them, when they consider ATS and the ESG, what would be most important for them? What do they think would be most important to hear about? In working with us as a supplier or as a company that they were looking to invest in. And we also asked our own employees, working at ATS, what do you think is most important for you? In terms of how we make sure that we're successful today, and but that we're preserving the resources that we need for tomorrow. Things like climate change and what are we doing to preserve resources that would positively impact climate change came out. We heard a lot from internal and external stakeholders about protecting people in terms of health and safety, and making sure that we send our employees home safely. We heard, areas in terms of social justice and making sure that that we are, providing an inclusive workspace, for women, for minorities. So I think that's really, the place to start is think about, what's most important to you, and what are those things that if you preserve those in the long run are going to make you more successful. And certainly that lends itself to thinking about sustainability and automation, because the two really are pointed at the same goal. Automation is really about thinking about how do we do things more efficiently, reducing waste, increasing our capacity, but doing that in a way that's really reliable, and that we know that, we've got a solution that works for us, and we can all, go to bed at night knowing that, we've got very stable, and high quality processes. Automation can do that for, in terms of sustainability, not only thinking about how can we produce a product in a way that we minimize the amount of energy that we're consuming. Sustainability also can come into play with automation, with thinking about waste and reducing waste of resources, whether that's packaging waste, whether that's product waste. The more that we have, a very stable, reliable manufacturing system, then that really positively impacts sustainability as well, because you're not having to try and produce 12,000 units in order to get 10,000 that are good. The goal is to have all 12,000 good and reduce the amount of energy, time, resources, raw materials, everything that goes into manufacturing that product. So I think they're very aligned.
That's a phenomenal piece of advice, and how you've tied where technology and innovation, sustainability, we're driving towards the same end state. It's really just a different perspective.
Right,
And it
right.
brings more information to the table to flesh out the entire picture of
Yeah.
what we're trying to do as businesses.
One of the really interesting things that I like about what ATS has done in not only our sustainability journey, but in supporting the journey of our customers, is when you look at footprint and some of the things that we're able to do, with increasing manufacturing capability, but actually shrinking the footprint, that the customer needs in order to do that. With and what's more sustainable than that when you think of physical buildings that need to be heated, cooled. If we can keep those footprints smaller, then isn't that more sustainable for all of us in terms of the amount that we need to consume in terms of energy just to have that entity exist?
And talking about a different perspective, so often you hear a company say, we're growing, we don't have the space. We don't have enough floor space to produce the good that we're trying to build. The different perspective here is if you can drive efficiency through some of your sustainability objectives, you're actually helping and driving towards the same objective.
Right, right, absolutely. So, I've seen lots of really interesting examples from within ATS where we were supporting a customer in bringing them a new manufacturing solution that actually had a smaller footprint than what they had before, and really enables them to say be within the same physical space but do more. And and I think that really goes a long way towards the sustainability journey when you think about it from an intensity factor of what does it cost from energy, from all the inputs, from resources. When you're able to boil it down to that one unit value, factoring all those different things in, smaller footprints make a big difference in sustainability.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Have you seen an example, a customer, a partner who has done that exceptionally well? Generally, we're always trying to build up a return on investment around any of the activities and actions that we're taking. And sometimes the topic that we're talking about right now can sort of be put off to the side.
Right.
Have you seen a best way where you bring that to the forefront and really build that into the business case?
Yeah. So, I look at, some of the work that we are doing in IWK is really interesting in that aspect with what they're doing in, now, with packaging lines being, faster, being more efficient, being smaller, and also their capability of really being able to advise their customers on packaging, and what might be, a better or a not so great way to go in terms of packaging. Thinking about sustainability, think about packaging costs, thinking about recyclability. There's lots of examples when we look into sort of that consumer products area that I think we've been very successful. Similarly, when I look at the life science business, I like a lot of what we're doing in the ability to work with our customers and work with their vendors and things like returnable packaging. So when we're bringing, inputs to the manufacturing process, that, we're looking at doing things like tray handling and returnables that, ultimately are going to have a much longer lifespan than bringing in, raw materials in packaging that, ultimately would become some form of waste.
We had Steve Emery as a guest earlier in the season, and we talked about impacts to supply chain for automation. And I think you just touched on one that's a thread between the two, is working with your partners, not necessarily just your customers, but your suppliers as well, for how you can work on these types of initiatives, returnable dunnage, returnable packaging, to drive more efficiency at both facilities.
Right. Yeah, that's actually one of the areas that I was talking with Steve and a member of his team earlier, where we're looking at doing some piloting with some of our vendors to say, in us building automation systems, where could we turn that mirror on ourselves and partner with some of our vendors to say, let's evaluate what sort of packaging, we're receiving, as part of our orders of components, and identify, is there some opportunity there to reduce that. As much as we have really strong processes in place for keeping track of our waste, we do regular waste audits, sorting waste, making sure that wherever we can divert waste to recycling, or, waste to, a reprocess into energy, we do that. But, it's recycling and diverting is great. But we also want to make sure that we're doing our homework just about reducing in the first place. So I think that's an area where, ATS, we can certainly tackle that in a bigger way, and working, with our customers as well to identify those areas where, with a little bit of study and some work, can we identify some opportunities where, maybe we can reduce the amount of waste incoming in the first place, and everybody wins from that, from not only the waste generation, but transportation costs.
Yeah, and I've seen with initiatives like that, the workforce and the culture of the business start to transform as well.
Hmm.
And when we're seeking to eliminate waste inside of our facility, it naturally gravitates over to waste inside of the business process as well.
Right.
So a simple example, not bringing packaged goods in for lunch, or bringing that waste home,
Hmm.
sort of drives a specific approach, a specific series of behaviors that I've then seen translate into the production on the shop floor, and even into design and things like that, where we are consistently targeting the elimination of waste.
One of the things that I really like about sustainability is watching employees really get excited about it and get involved. And I think there's so much more awareness around this now than there was 25 or 30 years ago, where employees who are parents, are having these discussions with their kids all the time. Just the other day, somebody was saying, "Yeah, my son is reminding me not to run the water while I'm brushing my teeth. Turn the tap on and off." But one of the things I really like is when we start working on some sustainability or say waste audit, it gets people's attention. They start contributing ideas, not only directly on the process, but it gets people thinking about other areas where, hey, somebody should have a look at this, or I'm going to have a look at this. So it's like a snowball effect that I think once people see that there's genuine interest and the company is looking for opportunities to improve, then that really opens up the doors to more and more ideas for what could we do differently or better.
I think that's a great message for those that are listening, in that where we started, sustainability, very big topic.
Right.
Find the piece that's practical or material to
Hmm.
you, and you'll see it build and grow
Yeah.
because it's a big topic. So just because it's a big topic doesn't mean it needs to be daunting. It provides a substantial amount of opportunity as long as you get moving.
Right. You really have to take it in small chunks, because you're right. It is a big topic. And when you read about some very, very good global initiatives for making the world a better place and a more sustainable place, it can feel like a lot. But I think if you try and break it down into I'm going to start, in my building, first of all, just understanding where we are. And one of the most simple things you can do is starting by understanding where your energy goes. So first of all, understanding how much energy, how much water you're consuming, but then try and break it down. We're fortunate that in many parts of the world, there's local governments or regional governments who are very supportive of those sorts of things. So it doesn't have to be all cash out. So I would encourage looking for opportunities to get a subsidy or rebate for doing something like an energy audit. So an energy audit goes one step further than looking at your monthly electrical bill. An energy audit, serves to break down, okay, you're consuming X kilowatt hours, per month or per year, but really what in your building is consuming, a certain amount. So looking for, pieces of equipment that might be energy sinks where, they're consuming, maybe you're surprised to see how much they're consuming. So that you can start thinking about, okay, is it a certain process that really X percentage of my energy is getting funneled into there when I look at sort of the breakdown of where are things going. It's not unlike really, managing your household budget where you have to figure out where you're spending money and then decide, okay, where's our best opportunities to try and recover some of that money. And then once you understand, from an energy perspective, where are your big hits in terms of consumption, then you can start doing the work to say, what are the alternatives? What could we do differently? What could we replace? And what might the return on investment might be? So even if there is an initial outlay, how fast will I win that back in terms of overall savings? And a lot of times you find, with aging equipment, the return on investment is pretty respectable and will actually pay you back in the long term. It ends up becoming a significant savings.
Wow. In that return on investment and the initial dollars that come out to drive efficiencies, are we normally seeing 2, 3, 4 year returns, or is it longer than that?
So I would say on average, I would say 3 to 4 year returns. Sometimes faster than that if you're able to qualify for a regional subsidy, because there's lots of local governments that are very active in trying to enable their manufacturing base, to become more sustainable. So, for example, over the past few years, we've seen lots of subsidies available for simple things like lighting systems. Getting away from less efficient lighting systems and going into LEDs. But a lot of times, if you're looking at improving processes, it's worth certainly talking to your utility, talking to your local or provincial government about what sort of investment you're looking to make in your facility and seeing what might qualify there in terms of a subsidy from an energy savings perspective. There's usually lots available.
We've tunneled in on energy savings across the facility, and I think that's a good place because it's probably the most practical way to get started.
hmm
Is there another area inside of the sustainability topic? You mentioned biodiversity, corporate social responsibility, some of the environmental. Is there another area that provides sort of a similar short-term view to return on investment, time, effort, capital?
Yeah. So water, I think, is another important area, and certainly what I look at within ATS. We've been able to demonstrate some good success when you look at food manufacturing, for example. Food manufacturing, we above all, we need to make sure that the consumer's health is protected, the equipment is clean. We don't have any problem with product contamination. So those systems typically will have some sort of a wash or clean in place system, and they utilize water. But we've been very successful in bringing new solutions to the table where we can reclaim, reuse, reduce the amount of water that's necessary in order to produce the same good outcome, and in terms of a very hygienic equipment. So water is an important area to consider as well.
And very similar line of thinking in that there are many governments around the world that offer subsidy programs to be able to get started onto these types of audits. Those audits drive efficiencies because we're looking at ways to reduce waste inside of our entire operation. And that's just another area that can snowball and grow.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think with any company that's looking at really growing their sustainability and thinking about where to start, really good to start by picking up the phone to your local utility providers, to your local government, and just asking questions about what's out there. Because I think there are often more services available than even we recognize, just to help sort of define where our biggest opportunities are to conserve more.
On this podcast, we talk a lot about technology, a lot about innovation for obvious reasons. We're talking about automation. What's become clear to me in this conversation is that if we choose to drive into these types of areas, we're actually going to drive a better understanding of our technology and our technology solutions as well. Because the more we understand them, the more we're able to drive efficiencies and eliminate waste.
Right, right. I think one of the things that I really like about working at ATS is we've got a lot of not only very smart but very creative people, and sort of the more we understand about the how we what the needs are, and think about the technology solutions that we are like, that marries up very nicely in the minds of these smart creative people we have in our teams to think of new ways of doing things. And I think that's really one of the most cool things about working with ATS is it's not just the same old out on the shop floor every day. There's always new ways of thinking. How do we make it smaller? How do we make it faster? How do we use less water but get to the same output? So there's always something in the potential.
Right. And that's where this sustainability and building a high-tech sustainable company marry so well
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
long-term view is you have smart people driving high technology companies. And if there's a means of bringing in a different perspective that ignites that passion or ignites that creativity towards the
Right.
end objective in a different way, then
Yeah.
we're all better off for it.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely. And I have to say that I'm very passionate about making sure that I see our people go home safe at night, and automation is really one of the things that helps drive that. I see time and again where as a company we really take not only the safety of our people into consideration as we build the equipment that we do, but we're really focused on making sure that the end user is safe. And I think that's a part of the sustainability story that anybody would have a real hard time arguing against is, we want our people to be safe. We all, whether it's ATS or any of our customers, we employ good people, and they do a great job for us, and we want to make sure they go home to their family at night. And I think we can really use automation as a way to help do that. To make sure that the toughest parts of the job, whether it's an ergonomic risk or hard on someone's back or shoulder, can we automate that to make that safer? To take that risk factor out. There's lots that we can do to eliminate the need for manual bending, loading, lifting through automation, which keeps everybody safer at the end of the day.
And that's a different view on sustainability too, right? Because we've talked about energy and waste, but at the same time, we want the
It's people,
sustainability of our own people. It all starts with people.
right?
And to be able to make sure that they're a resource that is well positioned for driving the business forward, not only today, but tomorrow,
Right.
really links into the health and safety portion of this
Sure.
discussion.
Yeah, I mean, we all have to work for a living, but there's all kinds of places we can work. And personally, I want to work at a place that looks after me. I want to work somewhere where I feel safe. Not only that I'm treated well, that I'm respected, but I'm not worried about getting hurt every day. And we can use automation to help with a lot of that, not only from ergonomics as we mentioned, but think about chemical risk. Think about physical hazards like noise, radiation. Included in what we do is making sure that we've got the right protective measures to keep people safe. While they're working with materials that might be aggressive or radioactive. So we're thinking about the employee's health as well. And how to protect that person, but still enable the job to get done.
Just even touching on those different industries that we have in this short conversation,
Yeah.
why you're such an expert in this field is being able to serve that variety of industries, talking about nuclear, talking about automation, food-based products. Have you seen across those very diverse companies, like what's the unifying thread in this world?
So I think the unifying thread is, I believe at the end of the day, people want to do the right thing. And I think once you know what the right thing is, it's very hard not to do it. So that for me is the one unifying factor, that whether it's food manufacturing, whether it's nuclear, whether it's transportation, we all want to know that we're doing the right thing, not only for our employees but our customers. And I think that's the tie that binds.
Yeah, and that's where it comes back to the leadership of businesses to prioritize and make space
Right.
for their teams to do the right thing,
Right.
to feel that they
Absolutely.
can contribute to
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
sustainability
And raise a
portion.
flag. They think, I think we're off course here. Then, yeah, okay, let's have that conversation and get back on track.
I think that's what gets me really excited about this topic in general is when it really boils down to the culture of the business, what leaders prioritize, and what we sort of enable our very smart people and our team members to do,
Hmm.
and sort of get that snowball going. It gets really exciting when you can do that in a way that not only helps the business, not only helps the community, but helps the world.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I love when I go out on the shop floor and I see the equipment and systems that we're designing and building for people. My first thought is really smart people work here. Like, who thought of that? It's amazing. I love seeing it. But equally, I love seeing how when you talk to our employees about what are they doing and why do it this way. They're really engaged. They're excited. They want to explain to you, why this is better than the old way. And they really, my observation is our employees can really connect the dots in terms of we're doing it this way because, not, and the answer isn't, because my boss told me or because the customer wants it, but because they really can understand and they're invested in the outcome, making it, a better piece of equipment, making it more reliable, less waste. So, it's nice to see that type of engagement. And I think, honestly, I think that spills over. Maybe we're getting on the S, the social part of ESG and sustainability a little bit, but I think it's sort of that positive mindset that it sets up where people see that they're working for a company that wants to keep them safe. They're working for they're doing something that's going to help prevent spills or releases or waste going to the environment. And it sort of gets you thinking about out there and the community. And one of the things that I really like about ESG is not only that we're trying to keep our people safe, we're trying to prevent harm to the environment, but also we're looking at our communities. So some of my favorite stories that I read in ATS is where we have sponsored a little league team, or we're out stocking shelves at a local food bank, or we're picking up trash along the highway. Because I think, that's the kind of company that I want to work for. And, that I like working with are companies that feel that connection to their community, that, they're there to be in business. They're there to build a product, to sell a product. But at the same time, they're also there to be part of the community. And I really like that aspect of sustainability.
I couldn't agree with you more. So, Cheryl, just as we come to the close of our conversation, if there was a listener out there that's still a little hesitant, they've heard everything that we've talked about and they're still hesitant to invest in sustainability initiatives, what would you say to them to close out our talk today?
So, I would say to them that, sustainability feels big, but it's actually made up of small actions taken together to build something bigger. So I would say, start small, start with something that feels manageable. Start with something that you see that, this is just a waste of time, where I see people shuffling this waste product, or, every time I'm paying the utility bills, I'm in shock at the cost. Start small with something that feels like a pain point, and go from there. Because it's not about, finding the magic wand that is going to, produce the perfect results overnight. It's about identifying step by step, incremental improvements that we can make that take us in the right direction. That's true sustainability.
Cheryl, that is absolutely great advice. Thank you so much for joining us today and providing such a valuable insight to those that are listening.
My pleasure, and I look forward to my invitation to return.
I would be happy to have you back.
Thank you, Simon.
To those listening, thank you so much for joining us today for episode 5 of the second season of our Enabling Automation podcast, where we touched on sustainability in high-tech companies. If you enjoyed the discussion today, and I sincerely hope that you did, please join us next time for episode 6, which is how automation and lean transformations complement each other. So a natural progression from today's conversation, where we'll dive a little bit deeper into the lean approach that takes you to automation.